Hi everyone, thanks for joining for today's call. I'm Niranjan. I take care of the Sentinel-1's Watch Over Threat Hunting program for the APJ region. I've been with the company for about 3 years. I'm the second employee of Sentinel-1 for India. And today I just want to give you an overview about how a particular malware builder toolkit called Royal Builder is being used by multiple APT groups for targeted attack operations for over 6 years now. And with that, I will also give you a brief about how we have been tracking over the last couple of years and how to stay ahead of these threat groups proactively. So over the period of time, as we learned about every single attacks, we also perform code analysis. We connect the dots to understand the real motivation behind every single attacks and how did the attackers get into an organization, what kind of kill chain stages have they done, like have they staged, have they stolen any information out of an organization, and so on. So I've got about 15 years of experience into cybersecurity, primarily working with malwares, code analysis, reverse engineering, tracking APT groups, primarily Chinese, Russian, Iranian groups. And then with that knowledge, I have been writing detection logics into the EDR products that I have worked in the past. That falls under detection engineering department. And I blog and speak about these topics in different conferences. Now, I've actually spoken about Royal Builder Toolkit in 2 conferences in the past in 2019, and it's interesting to see that this same Builder Toolkit is being used to generate malicious documents for spear phishing attacks even in 2023. Now, my topic today is to give you a highlight on a Chinese APT group targeting G7 summit attendees around mid of May. Now, on 20th of May, there was this summit that happened in Hiroshima, Japan. You can see like all the political leaders and great leaders around the world have attended that particular summit. Attackers need not invest too much of time and effort in crafting a malicious document. So they generally download the legitimate document from the website itself, as you see here, and then they have poisoned that particular document. The poisoned document still holds the real fonts and text of the summit related events details. And this particular document was also available over multiple websites. So it was easy for them to download the real document, later on inject a malicious payload into this particular file, and then they used it for spear phishing attack. Now, this is the email body. You can see how legitimate it looks like. The subject line was G20 India via UK Sherpa office. And it came from a compromised email address. I had to mask it for privacy reasons. In the 2 and BCC list were a huge list of attendees who have really attended that particular summit. And they were from government offices of France, UK, India, Singapore, and Australia. This was the email body as you see here. Now, the most interesting part was like from our telemetry of Sentinel-1, we didn't find any hits. But the moment when I reported about this particular attack, we received a call from Bangalore from one of the government officials who confirmed that they were using FireEye product though. The product did block this particular attack, and they were one among the targeted victims. This image actually gives you an overview about how the particular kill chain looks like. So the attachment comes over an email, typically in an RTF file format, rich text format. The vulnerability in this particular document is a 17-year-old equation editor vulnerability. So you can see like the bug was unreported or discovered for 17 years. And once it was reported in 2017 and got its CVE, and it's like 6 years now, still they have been targeting and using this particular vulnerability to target specific victims across the globe. The beauty and the weakness about the attackers in this particular case is like they were sticking to a specific file name of the malicious shellcode, which was just 8.t, e.t, and 5.t. From a detection standpoint, if you are looking for a file that got dropped with any of these file names in temp folder, you are sure that your machine was infected. So that's how easy the detection logic looked like. And then it gets decrypted and drops a malicious RAT or remote administration tool, which is capable of spying your machine, recording your voice, take screenshots, and so on, and then upload it to an attacker's C2. I'll show the code that is responsible to do that. Now, as I said, I've been tracking this particular builder toolkit for over 6 years. We are very sure that it's most likely a Chinese group's favorite toolkit, and they have been using it for last 6 years, and the victim or the location of where the victims operated were mostly South Asian countries like Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and so on. And the victims were primarily working out of government office, defense contractors, and all the other industry sectors as being highlighted here. Our research was also coinciding with FireEye's blog, as you can see here. So their naming of APT groups are slightly different from ours. So I'm just giving you something that's publicly available. So they are called two groups as APT-40 and temp conimines. And these are the malware names according to their nomenclature. And they have found more or less victims in the same region as we reported. Multiple malwares and droppers have been identified being dropped using this particular builder toolkit. One among them is IceFog dropper. As I said, 8.t is a pretty common name. If you are not familiar about builder toolkit, it makes the job very easy. It becomes configurable, so you can just name the payload as you need, as you select. But the weakness of the actors was like they're sticking to a similar name. They haven't changed the names much over the last 6 years. And they have relied on DLL sideloading technique. A lot of security analysts will be well aware of this particular technique in the past. Another malicious file that was seen dropped is known as Hawkeye dropper. The kill chain remained the same, more or less the same. This is the assembly level code that is responsible for decryption of shell code. As you can see, it's a single byte XOR loop. People with electronics communication background can easily understand that. This is how the encrypted shell code looks like. You don't see any readable strings here. This is the hex equivalent of opcodes here. Since it's encrypted shell code, the malware would decrypt it, and only then it will drop the main malicious file onto the disk, thereby performing the malicious activities after that. There's another malware group known as Danti, and it was targeting users across Kyrgyzstan. More or less the infection chain looked the same. The Lure document used was using Russian fonts here. That's because the victims were located in Russian and Ukrainian regions. Another malware using the same technique is called NucoRat. You can see the functionalities supported by this particular remote administration tool. So if an organization employee gets infected by such a remote administration tool, you can just imagine the risk level of that particular endpoint. The malware can easily rename your files, copy, delete your files, execute additional files. It can search through your file folders, download additional files onto your machine, upload the stolen information to an attacker C2 and so on. It can even monitor your screen. Now, Chinese APT groups have got this, tendency. They are very much interested in performing surveillance. And when the Russia-Ukraine war was happening, they didn't spare even that particular region. Now, there are 3 groups that we have been tracking known to target entities in Russia and Ukraine, again using Royal Build toolkit. Here is the timeline that briefly talks about different files being used around mid of 2022. You can see the hash values and the Russian file name theme being used for several attacks during that time period. We'll go back to the G7 summit targeting attack. Now, if an user would have accidentally executed that particular dropper, the next level payload happened to be a DLL file. As you all know, DLL files don't execute by itself. It needs a loader to execute the code programmed in a DLL file. And that is done through calling an export function of the DLL. Here is another weakness by the attacker. They have stick to a specific export function name, which has been commonly seen in past attacks as well. Start a lame technique by the attackers. So as I said, the next level or the next thing that a malware researcher would do is reviewing the code of the payload. And the first thing that I noticed was like they were using a technique called API hashing, which means the necessary API functions are not being called directly, like get file name, create file W and so on. Instead, they were using a hash value equivalent to any API function just to make the lives of the malware researchers slightly difficult. But these hash values are recorded and it's there in knowledge base of any researcher. So it's easy for us to understand which API function represents what hash value. And then they would call the specific API function using call EAX instruction. Again, not that difficult. As I said, a DLL function could not be executed by itself, so they were taking the help of a loader. The loader would normally decrypt the content, and here is the example of the decryption loop used by the loader to execute the code out of a DLL file. So as this loop keeps executing, as you see here, readable strings, folder paths, or API function names gets resolved in the memory at the bottom, as you see here, system32/ntdll.dll, and necessary DLLs like kernel32 and so on. For a detection logic standpoint, you need to know the equivalent code. If you are bad in programming, a disassembler like IDAPRO would give you the equivalent pseudocode, as you see on the right side. So all I have to do is like assign variable values and write a small code that works in an opposite fashion to this particular decryption loop, and I will be able to understand what string values gets generated post execution of a loop. Now, as I said, they have been sticking around to a similar TTPs for a very long time. So they would, try to steal information from a victim's machine. In this case, the endpoint name, operating system name, version information, username of the endpoint. If your computer is connected to an internet or not, and IP configurations and so on, and what is the name of the antivirus installed on that particular endpoint are all being collected by the remote administration tool. So as I said, is the first level of surveillance, meaning a spyware kind of operation. The informations collected are later encrypted using RC4 and encoded with base 64 so that your SOC analysts don't see anything readable being transmitted from your endpoint to an attacker C2. So they have intentionally encrypted or changed the format of the data being stolen from the endpoint using these two operations, RC4 and base 64. The key that was being used for encryption is this random value, as you see here. The pseudocode used for encryption using RC4 is shown here. One of the easiest way for you to understand if it's an RC4 encryption is if you see a variable assigned with value 256, and then an XOR operation happens somewhere after that. I can't see it clearly here. So that clearly tells you like an RC4 operation is happening with some input as a data with a static key. And later on it was encoded with base 64 before being sent to an attacker C2. So this is the encrypted blob of data that gets sent to the attacker C2, to evade from a SOC analyst eyes, basically. There was another string in the binary, which is base 64, and you can easily decode a base 64 string, and that was giving this, ASCII string, as you see, a go anywhere _up.gsp. We have never seen a string used by any malware in the past using this particular string. And this is how the entire pattern of data gets transmitted from a compromised endpoint. This is the attacker C2. The port used was 8001. And you can see this static string unique to this particular malware. And then there is that base 64 plus RC4 encrypted data being sent back to attacker for initial reconnaissance, meaning only for the attacker to understand what endpoint has he successfully compromised. And this is how the panel looked like. Now, with the stolen information here, he would just log in and store your endpoint details on his panel. There was an overlap with Go Anywhere FTA being abused with Clopp's global intrusion attempts. I don't know how much of you guys were aware about Papercut vulnerability and MoveIt. It had a global impact, and they were also FTA applications, and it was a hot favorite of Clop ransomware group, a Russian-based ransomware groups believed to be having a tie with Russian government, funded and getting a lot of government assistance for their operation throughout the world. So There were 4 FTA applications targeted by CLOP around the same time when this Chinese group was using this Go Anywhere managed file transfer to store stolen information. Now, why do I say this is because we were dealing with only one particular dropper, one particular email address to target more than 35 victims. Such cases normally make it challenging for us to attribute a particular file to a known group. CrowdStrike calls it as Sharp Panda APT group behind the attack. We don't have enough evidence from SentinelOne to classify this attack under a specific APT group. I don't want to name any particular group behind this attack, but the traits of TTP that I've explained in the past slides clearly shows it's a Chinese APT group, and they are known to target G7 and G20 attendees in the past. Again, they use DLL sideloading. The first stage of attack looks very similar. The shell code name looked similar. The loader code also looked similar. Victimology also looked similar. So these traits clearly shows like it's highly a Chinese APT group that is behind the attack, and there could be a slight overlap between different Chinese groups. So I don't want to confuse or wrongly classify the attack behind any specific APT group name. Now, this research was being published under different journals in the last 2-3 months. We also gave an interview for Australian Financial Review 2 or 3 months back. You can always read through them. That's pretty much it from my side. Thank you so much for joining my talk today. Thanks, everyone.